Welcome back to Open Line. First day of school, talking about school safety and the School Safety Working Group. We have with us the Commissioner of Homeland Security, David W. Purkey, and Bryce Allen, the Office of Homeland Security Supervisory Agent, and talking about the School Safety Working Group. We talked about they're going to develop a secure statewide technology application for anonymous reporting of threats. Let's say, what action do you anticipate being taken once you get a credible threat? And I'll ask you that. What do we do? You get it, well, what do you do?
There's a couple different ways that we handle it. Once that threat initially will come into our watch center, they're going to go ahead and notify the local jurisdictions of where that threat is coming from, as well as they're going to notify our intelligence analysts and our agents as well, so that we can work it on our side. If we deem that threat to be credible, then we're going to partner with local law enforcement, federal government if we need to, and go ahead and try to step in and disrupt anything that might be in the works that could potentially be happening.
Are we seeing a lot of threats disrupted now? Do you feel good about the number of threats we're disrupting? And I guess that also dovetails into a question of, I think sometimes people are reluctant to report something because they're not sure that it's going to rise to the level of, this person is going to act on some of this stuff. And I think that people sometimes are just reluctant. But I mean, what are you seeing? Are we disrupting a lot of things now or not? Or what are you seeing?
During the school year, we get several threats a week, and we investigate to follow up on them. Most of them we find not to be credible, thank goodness. But occasionally we have a few that have come through where we have been able to step in and stop whatever that individual might have had intentions on doing. Fortunately, we have been able to stop everything thus far. But what we're finding is that people do feel a little bit uncomfortable about reporting because they're not necessarily sure. I look at it from this standpoint. As a law enforcement officer, I'd rather investigate and be wrong. I'd rather look into something, find that there was no credibility to it, and that there was no threat, than for us to find out later on that we could have potentially stopped something ahead of time. So what we encourage people to do is, if they have a suspicion, if they see something that doesn't seem right to them, or they hear something that doesn't seem right to them, see something on social media, that they err on the side of caution and report it. Again, it's nothing for us to investigate it and find out later that it turned out to be uncredible, and we're perfectly fine with that. We'd rather err on that side of caution.
And Ben, that dovetails into what is a national motto that we follow in Tennessee: see something, say something. I mean, if you see something out of the ordinary in your local community, you know how things are supposed to look. You know who's supposed to be there and who's not. We encourage you to report that. Even if it ends up being a false reporting, we want to look into that, because that is how things are disrupted. So I would encourage members of the public to not ever worry about calling public safety or accessing this app and reporting something, because they may very well be the linchpin that keeps something from happening. What
is the #1 indicator? Is it a post on social media generally, or is it that just little Johnny is depressed? Because again, that makes you feel like, I don't know if he's just depressed, or at what point does it rise to the level? And you're saying, report it, have it investigated, but what do you think people should look for?
Changes in behavior are the biggest things that we encourage people to look for. When someone's normal behavior, how you know them to be, you start seeing that slow, gradual change over time. They start kind of secluding themselves away from other people. They start engaging in other behaviors or other activities that they normally weren't involved in. They kind of start having that I'm going to end it all kind of attitude out there. That's when we encourage people to really take those kind of indicators seriously and step forward and say something. I can't give you any clear cut, if this happens, you must report it. Unfortunately, every case has been different. There's no way for us to kind of pick out one certain thing. But we encourage people to look at behavior. Because if I know somebody, I know how they are. And then when there's that change going on in their life, it tells me that something's happening. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to become violent. I don't know for sure, but it does tell me that they're under some degree of stress and they're not managing it. So that's why we encourage people to step forward, and let's look at it.
And when you've looked at, I'm sure part of what you've done is you've examined these past cases all across the country. How often were there just obvious sort of warning signs? And maybe were there a lot of cases where there wasn't a warning sign?
Every case has been different. Unfortunately, after the fact, it's very easy for us to come back and say we should have picked this up at several points along the process. When it's happening, it's much more challenging, it's much more difficult. So it's really hard to second guess some of these past cases, but I would have to say that, yeah, there's usually indicators along the way. We just have to be in tune to them, we have to pay attention to them.
I'm comforted by that. I mean, it makes me feel a little safer if I do feel like there were usually indicators along the way. And I think now people are so sensitive to this that hopefully they are willing to say something and action can be taken. People aren't messing around with this. You know, if somebody, if somebody's acting in a way like you were describing, hopefully it's reported and investigated and taken seriously. One of the other things you were talking about is more school resource officers. So that takes money. Do we know, what are we tangibly talking about here when we're talking about more school resource officers?
Well, it does take money for SROs, and it's probably one of the more expensive points of security that you can have for the school system, in much the same way that your police departments, fire departments, and sheriff's departments are usually some of the biggest expenditures in local government. And I can say that from being a county mayor for 16 years. But clearly, we have seen time and time again the success of the SRO program. So within this money, the governor put an additional $30 million in the budget, recommended it to the General Assembly, and they approved it. And that was added to $5 million that was already in the budget. $10 million of that is recurring funding that can pay for things year after year. $25 million was for things, one-time cost, security improvements. But we opened all of that money up for funding of SROs. For example, if you have a distressed school district and they just don't have money for SROs, they've barely got money to fund deputy sheriffs for the road, then we will help them get started with that, either with recurring money or non-recurring money. So there is a mechanism built in that they can make that application if that's their biggest need. But it all comes from these vulnerability assessments. The assessments were designed for them to very readily identify what their biggest needs are. And it may be an SRO. If it is, we intend to help them with that because we know it's effective. We know it's effective for relationships. We know it's effective for security. We know parents like SROs. And immediately law enforcement has a liaison there that's tied into the system through a radio, all the other methods that law enforcement officers talk to each other, and is readily there for anything that happens. So we believe in the SRO program.
Did you see a lot of districts that don't have one and that say we don't have the money? And I know in Davidson County, most schools, maybe every school has an SRO. I'm not sure about that, but certainly a lot of schools have SROs. What about when you get outside into some of the more rural areas?
Well, there were some that did not, particularly in the distressed counties. Bryce helped me with this, but and a lot of counties have an SRO that covers 2 or 3 schools. While that is better than not having an SRO, it's not the same as having them on site. To be physically out in front when the school opens of a morning, to be physically in the cafeteria when the largest groups of students are there, or to be physically there when the buses and the parents are coming in. So we found that situation a lot. But we do know, and we've already seen results, that the work of this governor's working group has inspired counties to put additional resources and SRO monies into their budgets. We have seen that in a lot of counties. So we're saying if that's your biggest need, if you really think it is, make your application. We'll try to fulfill that need from these monies, but certainly the goal is to have one in every school.
That's great. I would love to see one in every school. And you think, is that a doable goal? Is that achievable?
I think it's doable over the relatively short term, in 3 to 4 years. You know, every community, and again, as a former mayor, you just set your priorities. And those priorities are based on the changing cultural, environmental, or threat environment of your community. And that's what we do in our department, particularly in the Office of Homeland Security. We are constantly, on a weekly basis, evaluating the threat matrix. And we change our tactics, we change our resources based on that. clearly there's a need here. With this changing threat matrix, we're seeing more of these school shootings, so SROs need to be a priority.
And I'll ask you, Bryce, do you see more, is this more of a rural problem or an urban problem, or can we quantify it in those terms?
You really can't quantify it. What we're finding is that this can happen in any community. Large, small, urban, rural, it doesn't really matter. It's not defined to any one particular geographical area. It really seems to be across the board.
Okay. And the parents' role, that was something else we want to talk about. Who wants to take that? I mean, obviously there's a lot being done here, but what role do you think the parents should be taking? Bryce, what about that?
In my opinion, they have to have an active role in this prevention piece as much as law enforcement or the school officials do, because they spend just as much time, if not more, with their children than anybody does, as well as they interact with their child's friends and social circles. So they can very well easily become aware of something as it's developing. They know their child better than anybody, so they can see those changes in behavior. So we encourage parents to take that very active role in order to be observant, look for things, look for changes.
And I know what you've been talking about is ways to prevent this. Was there any discussion about penalizing parents in some way if they contribute to this? I don't know, whether the kid gets a gun there, or did you all talk about those kinds of things, the punitive side, as a deterrent?
Not really, Ben. We didn't really get into those discussions per se. It was more about prevention, response, and follow-up. Making sure that threats are evaluated, needs are met, and particularly mental health needs are met. We see time and time again mental health issues affecting what's happening in the public safety arena. So there are provisions within this working group's recommendations to develop teams to handle mental health situations and make sure that that's something that is on the forefront and is handled. To give you an example, the State Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse, they have emergency services coordinators that answer to TEMA, the watch point like we mentioned before. So they can very easily be tapped by that watch point 24 hours a day to deal with any specific situation to make sure that someone's needs are handled. But punitive measures for the parents, no. It was more of a discussion about how do we help parents have the tools that they need to recognize something is different or something is wrong so that it can be disrupted. That word cannot be overused. We use that word daily in terrorism circles. Our goal, if there is something being planned, is to disrupt it. That's what we're trying to do. It's no different with a school shooting. We want to disrupt that in some way to keep it from happening.
Why don't we take a call? Let's go to John. Hello, John.
Yes.
Hi, what's on your mind?
Oh, okay, I'm on. Well, this, you know, on the iPad, I've seen a 40-millimeter multi-launcher, non-lethal. The reason why they should have a bunch of them in there, so when, you know, different stations, so the teacher can code it in and open up the door. When he opens up the door, take it out and go after the person that's doing the shooting. That would be the first line of defense, and this would knock the person down. You know,
so you're talking about
like a beanbag.
You're talking about weapons inside the school.
Yeah, a weapon that is non-lethal. Now, if a kid gets hold of it, well, he's not going to die, but he'll be hurting. But some disruptive kid might want to, you know, break into it and get it. But if he doesn't, you know, at least it gives them first defense until the police get there and possibly have to use lethal force. You know?
Let's talk about that. John, thanks for the call. All right, so obviously there's a huge debate about arming teachers and more guns in school. He's talking about something that's non-lethal that would at least stop a shooter potentially, and I guess wouldn't be lethal. What about some of those things? Were those discussed, guns, and then he's talking about something a little different? What about that?
Well, I'll ask Bryce to help me, but yes, there was discussion about And we know that law enforcement officers every day use as a part of their arsenal non-lethal methods. We know that that happens every day. But again, I would come back to the SRO as the consensus of the working group, that was the safest, the most effective, the best use of a highly trained person, because it's not just a routine police officer or deputy sheriff. They are trained to be a school resource officer, and just everything that goes along with that. And they employ non-lethal methods too, whether it's tasers or whatever methods, OC gas that they deploy. So those methods already exist if you have an SRO there. Bryce?
Yeah, absolutely. Not only did the working group really look at that as being one of the best options, but we even talked to teachers themselves, and they looked at it that same way, because let's face it, at the end of the day, the job of the teacher is to teach the students. So it's better to have a dedicated professional whose sole job is security to focus in specifically on that task. And law enforcement already has non-lethals, so it's addressing exactly what he suggested.
The issue is emotional. It in some ways, the whole gun debate can become part of it. There's some that say there should be more guns, that teachers should be armed. There's some that just say, boy, that's a terrible idea. Did you all just stay away from that, or you think SROs are the way to go and not teachers with guns? Is that kind of what the consensus of this group was?
Well, and again, Bryce can help me on this, but there's a constant discussion about guns in schools and who is the best person to arm. What type of training do you need to do that? Do you want untrained people, being armed? No, not generally. What about retired military? What about retired police officers? And there are some provisions in state law to allow for districts to employ those people and have them in the schools. But I would come back around again to what was the consensus of the working group. And our goal was to reach consensus at the end. And the consensus was, remember, there were subject matter experts from public safety, education, and mental health. And the consensus was that the SRO was the single best way to protect a school and have the relationships that are necessary so that information is exchanged and the school is best prepared to handle an active shooter situation.
And did you have anything? What about that?
Yeah, responding in an active shooter situation or any kind of violent situation in a school environment is an extremely high stress situation. The best police officers, the most highly trained officers have a very difficult time operating in that environment. It would be unfair to put someone in there who didn't have that level of training, which is why, again, we come back to that SRO, that law enforcement professional being tasked with that specific role.
I understand that. All right, let's take a break. If you want to call in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS. 615-737-7587. Take a break. Be back right after this.